morning haze hung low over the fields of Kursk, thick enough to hide the glint of metal and the movement of men. It was July 5th, 1943, the opening day of the largest tank battle in history. As German panzer divisions prepared their advance, a silence momentarily settled over the front. Then came the sound, low, guttural, growing louder with each second. It wasn't artillery or tanks. It was something from above. Out of the haze, a formation of low-flying aircraft emerged, cutting just meters above the treetops. Their shapes were squat and angular, with armored skins and stubby wings bristling with rockets and cannons. The noise was unlike any other, deeper, more mechanical, like a growl rather than a roar. It was the Mikulan engine of the IL-2 Sturmovik, and to those on the ground, it meant one thing. Destruction was seconds away. The German infantry scrambled for cover. Flak guns opened fire in panic. But the first wave of rockets had already struck, supply trucks shredded, anti-tank emplacements silenced, and forward command posts engulfed in smoke. The IL-2s flew in with surgical intent, peeling off in pairs, delivering bursts of 23mm cannon fire into tank columns and retreating before ground fire could lock on. Each pass was deliberate, precise. No theatrics, just brutal efficiency. To the Wehrmacht soldiers who faced it, the Sturmovik was not just another aircraft. It was a symbol of Soviet resilience, a machine born for revenge, forged in urgency. With its armored belly and powerful strike payload, it flew low, hit hard, and refused to die. Survivors would speak of its passes in hushed tones. They had other names for it too, the flying tank, Black Death. But behind the fear it inspired lay something more calculated. The IL-2 wasn't built to terrify. It was built to solve a problem, one the Red Army had no time to ignore. By the winter of 1941, the German Wehrmacht had driven deep into Soviet territory. Operation Barbarossa had caught the Red Army unprepared, fractured, and reeling. Entire divisions were encircled and destroyed. Cities fell in rapid succession. German panzers moved with devastating momentum, carving corridors through Soviet defenses, supported by the Luftwaffe's Stukas and fighter squadrons. The front was collapsing, not because the Red Army lacked courage, but because it lacked coordination, mobility, and above all, modern tactical support from the air. At the heart of the Red Army's problem was its doctrine, or rather, the absence of one that matched the fast-changing reality of mechanized warfare. Soviet infantry, unsupported by mobile artillery or air cover, were mowed down by advancing tanks and pinned by precise German dive bombing. What few aircraft remained were outdated or outclassed. Fighters like the I-16 were no match for Messerschmitts, and light bombers were shredded by anti-aircraft fire before reaching their targets. The Soviet Air Force, BVS, had been gutted in the opening weeks of the war, with over 4,000 aircraft destroyed by the end of 1941, many of them still on the ground. But amidst the chaos, a need became blindingly clear. The Red Army didn't just need planes. It needed a weapon in the sky that could directly support troops on the ground, a flying artillery piece that could travel with advancing armor, destroy enemy emplacements, and shatter German formations before they reached Soviet lines. A hammer in the air to match the anvil of T-34s on the ground. This was not a new idea. The Germans had demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of close air support with their Ju-87 Stukas during the invasion of Poland and France. But the Soviet vision was more pragmatic. They didn't want a dive bomber. They needed something sturdier, something that could survive enemy fire, strike hard, and come back for more. They envisioned a flying tank, literally. Even before the war, Soviet engineer Sergei Ilyushin had proposed such a design. He believed in a dedicated ground attack aircraft, one armored from the start, not adapted from a bomber or fighter. His prototype had first flown in 1939, but production had been slow, and higher command, still focused on strategic bombing and air defense, showed little interest. That changed after June 22, 1941. With the Wehrmacht sweeping across the steppe, Soviet factories scrambled to produce anything that could fly. The IL-2, long ignored, was suddenly pushed to the front of production lines. Stalin himself issued a direct order. The IL-2s are as essential to the Red Army as air and bread. It was no longer a concept, it was a necessity. But necessity did not mean readiness. Early models were rushed, underpowered, and flew without a rear gunner, making them easy prey for enemy fighters. Yet crews flew them anyway. Losses were brutal. Still, the idea held. The concept was solid. The design just needed time and commitment. By late 1942, that commitment had arrived. The IL-2 was evolving. Armor plating was refined. Engines were upgraded. Gunner positions were restored. And Soviet doctrine began to shift accordingly. IL-2 units were now integrated into combined arms tactics, flying in tight formations to cover one another, synchronizing with tank advances, and following infantry breakthroughs. The Eastern Front was vast, brutal, and unforgiving. But the Soviets were adapting. Where the Luftwaffe had peaked and begun to overextend, the VVS was rebuilding, smarter, leaner, and equipped with something uniquely tailored to their needs. The IL-2 wasn't a miracle weapon. It wasn't fast, agile, or elegant, but it could fly low through flak, strike with surgical violence, and return, again and again. And in a war measured by attrition and pressure, that was enough to change the tide. The genesis of the IL-2 did not begin on the battlefield, but in the design rooms of the Soviet Union's aviation industry in the late 1930s. At a time when air forces around the world focused on fighters and strategic bombers, one engineer, Sergei Ilyushin, believed the future of air power lay in direct support of ground troops. He envisioned an aircraft built not merely to survive in combat, but to dominate the low-altitude battlefield, a heavily armored flying gun platform that could operate within reach of enemy small arms and anti-aircraft fire and still complete its mission. In 1938, Ilyushin and his team at the Central Design Bureau began developing the prototype TSKB-55. Unlike conventional aircraft, this new design integrated an armored shell directly into the load-bearing structure of the fuselage. Instead of bolting armor onto a frame, the aircraft was literally built around its protection. The resulting shell was forged from 4 to 12 millimeters thick steel plates, wrapping around the cockpit, engine, and essential systems. The pilot, and in later versions, the rear gunner were enclosed in what was effectively a steel bathtub, capable of withstanding rifle-caliber rounds and even some anti-aircraft shrapnel. The design evolved into the TSKB-57, then received its military designation, IL-2. First flown in October 1939, the aircraft showed promise, but also serious limitations. The early single-seat versions were sluggish, underpowered, and vulnerable to enemy fighters. They were equipped with a Mikulin AM-35 engine, but it lacked the low-altitude torque needed for the aircraft's intended role. In combat, the IL-2's speed and maneuverability were noticeably inferior. Pilots reported difficulty in pulling up after attack dives. Worse, without a rear gunner, they were sitting ducks for Bf-109s once the attack run ended. Despite these issues, the IL-2 entered production in 1941, propelled not by perfection but by desperation. Soviet factories, under increasing pressure from the German advance, began building the aircraft en masse. It wasn't long before frontline crews started modifying the design themselves. Crews installed makeshift gunner positions behind the pilot, using scavenged weapons. Engineers took notice. By 1942, the revised two-seat variant became standard. The addition of a rear-facing 12.7mm UBT machine gun drastically improved survivability against enemy fighters. At the same time, engine upgrades brought the Mikulin AM-38 into service, offering better low-altitude performance and more reliability in combat conditions. In terms of firepower, the IL-2 was designed to punish armor and infantry alike. The aircraft carried a devastating arsenal. Twin 23mm VIA, 23 cannons in the wings, capable of piercing tank armor from above. 7.62mm SHKS machine guns for soft targets, and underwing hardpoints for a combination of 82mm or 132mm rockets, RS-82 and RS-132, and up to 600 kilograms of bombs. The typical attack profile involved a shallow dive, rocket or bomb release, followed by strafing runs with cannon fire. A direct hit from a VIA 23 could disable a Panzer III or IV by shredding the turret or engine deck. Yet the plane's most important trait wasn't its firepower. It was its survivability. German pilots, astonished at how much damage an IL-2 could take, dubbed it the flying tank. Stories abounded of IL-2s limping back to base with wings torn, tails riddled, canopies shattered, but engines still running. The aircraft's armored core kept pilots alive long enough to fight another day. No other frontline ground attack aircraft in the war, not even the American 47 Thunderbolt, or German Ju-87, offered that same degree of built-in protection. Still, the IL-2 had weaknesses. Its cockpit visibility was limited. It lacked high-altitude capability, and its heavy frame made it cumbersome in evasive maneuvers. But none of these mattered in the role it was designed for. The IL-2 was not built to dogfight. It was built to fly low, strike hard, and endure the hell that awaited just above the treetops. By 1943, its silhouette had become instantly recognizable on the Eastern Front: broad wings, long fuselage, fixed landing gear, and an unmistakable roar. As Soviet doctrine matured, the IL-2 became more than a weapon. It became a system. Aircraft flew in mutually supporting formations. Timing with ground assaults was synchronized down to the minute. Specialized regiments were formed solely around IL-2 squadrons. The flying tank was no longer a prototype. It was a cornerstone of Soviet combined arms warfare. The first true test of the IL-2's potential came not in a quiet proving ground, but in the blood-soaked fields of Kursk in the summer of 1943. By then, the aircraft had already been in service for nearly 2 years, with mixed results. But Kursk, Operation Citadel, was different. It was the turning point, the moment when the IL-2 would no longer be seen as a desperate improvisation, but as a decisive weapon of war. The Germans had launched a massive offensive to pinch off the Kursk salient and regain the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. They committed some of their best armored divisions, Leibstandard, Das Reich, Totenkopf, and an unprecedented number of Panther and Tiger tanks. The Soviets, anticipating the assault, had fortified the region with layered defenses, minefields, and deep artillery positions. But perhaps the most critical advantage lay in the sky. On the morning of July 5th, just before the German advance began, waves of IL-2s roared into the air from hastily prepared forward airstrips. Their objective was clear: disrupt the coordination of German armored spearheads, destroy soft-skin vehicles, and obliterate anti-tank emplacements. Flying low and fast, IL-2 squadrons moved in formations of 4 to 6, providing mutual cover and overlapping fields of fire. This was not the ad hoc chaos of 1941. It was doctrine, practiced, rehearsed, and brutally effective. One such formation, led by Captain Ivan Malyugin of the 174th SHAP, Assault Aviation Regiment, targeted a column of German tanks and support vehicles near the village of Alkovatka. The weather was clear, the terrain open. From his cockpit, Malyugin could see the dust trails of armor moving below. He radioed his flight: hold formation. Target, center of the column. We strike together. Diving from 1,200 meters, Malyugin aligned his gun sight and Panzer IV. At 800 meters, he released 2 RS-82 rockets. One missed. The other struck the vehicle's rear, igniting fuel stores and erupting in a plume of flame. He leveled out, rolled slightly to the right, and let his VIA-23 cannons speak, short bursts aimed at troop carriers and half-tracks. His wingmen followed, blanketing the road with fire. The convoy scattered. Troops dismounted and ran for tree lines. But on open ground, there was little cover from death descending at 400 kilometers per hour. By the end of the run, 5 vehicles were destroyed. Malyugin's IL-2 had taken 2 hits, one in the wing, another in the tail, but the aircraft held together. They circled back for another pass. No hesitation. They were flying a machine built for this moment. Nearby, other IL-2 regiments were striking German artillery positions that had begun shelling Soviet mine-clearing teams. One flight released cluster bombs, another strafed the gun crews as they tried to reposition. What made the IL-2 so effective wasn't just firepower, it was timing. They hit the Germans in the early moments of the battle, when momentum mattered most, when confusion could cost hours, even days. In another sector, near Panayrai, a German reconnaissance battalion came under attack from a squadron of IL-2s equipped with FAB-100 bombs. The bombs tore craters in the roads, splintered supply trucks, and disabled 2 self-propelled guns. Survivors recalled the shriek of incoming ordnance, followed by silence, then the sudden rush of air as the planes passed overhead. One Wehrmacht corporal, writing in his diary, simply called them the Hammer of the East. Soviet infantry who advanced behind the airstrikes noticed a difference too. Resistance was lighter. Machine gun nests were silenced. Armored vehicles, still smoldering, were abandoned. The IL-2 had carved lanes of entry through what was supposed to be a wall of steel. In the words of a T-34 commander from the 5th Guards Tank Army, "We didn't break the enemy alone. The Sturmoviks broke them first. We just rolled through what they left behind. The risks were high. Anti-aircraft fire was constant. German Flak 36 and 37 guns were deadly accurate. IL-2s were not invincible, and losses were sustained. Sometimes entire formations would not return. But for every aircraft lost, another took its place. And more importantly, the psychological effect was mounting. German soldiers began to dread the low growl of the Mikulin engine. When Soviet armor advanced, it was often preceded not by artillery, but by the shadows of IL-2s skimming the treetops. By the end of the Battle of Kursk, Soviet sources claimed over 3,000 ground attack sorties per day at peak intensity. The IL-2 had become a fixture, a part of the rhythm of battle. Every forward push, every armored thrust, every major counteroffensive was now coordinated with aerial hammer strikes. The aircraft's presence was no longer surprising. It was expected, and that expectation brought with it a new kind of power, not just in the weapons it carried, but in the fear it instilled. The impact of the IL-2 was not confined to a single battlefront. What began as a desperate attempt to support collapsing Soviet lines had, by 1944, evolved into a core pillar of the Red Army's offensive strategy. The Sturmovik was no longer an auxiliary asset. It was a calibrated instrument of battlefield disruption, deeply woven into the fabric of Soviet combined arms doctrine. With every counterattack, every advance, the IL-2 was expected to lead the way, striking first, blinding the enemy, and softening resistance before tanks and infantry moved in. Nowhere was this strategic integration more evident than in Operation Bagration, the massive Soviet summer offensive of June 1944 that shattered Army Group Center and effectively ended German control over Belarus. The scale was enormous. Over 2 million Soviet troops, 5,000 tanks, and nearly 5,300 aircraft. At the heart of the air campaign were the IL-2s, over 1,000 of them deployed in coordinated waves. Their objectives were precise and relentless. In the opening hours of the assault, IL-2 squadrons struck German communication centers, rear echelon supply depots, and artillery batteries with exacting repetition. They flew in echelon formations, some armed with rockets and bombs for heavy targets, others equipped only with cannon and machine guns for mop-up runs. Air-ground liaison officers, often embedded with tank and infantry commanders, radioed coordinates directly to the pilots. Entire German road columns were destroyed in motion. Retreating panzer divisions found themselves boxed in by craters and wreckage, then strafed into immobility. What changed during Bagration wasn't the aircraft, it was the way the Soviets used it. The IL-2 became the fulcrum of a broader orchestration, synchronized with ground movements, artillery barrages, and deception campaigns. Each strike was timed not just for maximum destruction, but for maximum confusion. The Luftwaffe, depleted and overstretched, could no longer provide consistent air cover. German troops were left to face the Sturmovik alone, often with little more than light flak or handheld weapons. The Wehrmacht responded as best it could. Tactics evolved. Camouflage became more elaborate. Convoys moved only under cover of darkness or during poor weather. New anti-aircraft units were rushed to the front, equipped with the 37mm Flak 43 and the mobile 20mm Flak Vierling 38. Some tank units were paired with self-propelled flak vehicles like the Wirbelwind or Ostwind. But these adaptations were reactive, not strategic, and often too late. The Germans also began altering how they grouped vehicles in the field. Instead of tight, organized columns, they dispersed across wider areas to reduce the effectiveness of concentrated attacks. They dug shallow trenches beside parked tanks to allow for faster crew evacuation during airstrikes. Infantry were trained to scatter at the first sign of low-flying aircraft. But fear is difficult to train out, and the IL-2's presence had become psychological as much as tactical. German reports referred to the Sturmovik corridor, a term coined by frontline commanders to describe the low-altitude airspace dominated by IL-2 squadrons during Soviet offensives. It was a space German forces entered with dread and rarely exited intact. In a captured letter from a German lieutenant stationed near Mogilev, one line stood out. The Russians no longer fight with tanks first, they fight with thunder. Their sky machines strike before we ever see their soldiers. Despite their losses, some IL-2 units reporting attrition rates as high as 30% during sustained operations, the Soviets pressed on. They had optimized the aircraft for mass production, simplified maintenance, and prioritized replacement over perfection. A downed pilot was a tragedy. A downed aircraft was a gap to be filled before dawn. By the final months of 1944, IL-2s were conducting not just frontline assaults, but deep penetration strikes against German logistics and retreat paths. In East Prussia, Sturmoviks destroyed entire columns of horse-drawn wagons carrying ammunition and food to isolated Wehrmacht pockets. In Hungary, they disrupted counterattacks by SS panzer divisions, crippling fuel convoys and artillery positions before they reached staging areas. For the Red Army, the IL-2 was a multi-tool, a hammer, a scalpel, and a message. It told the enemy that Soviet forces were coming, and that they no longer moved alone. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the Soviet Union emerged from the war scarred, exhausted, but victorious. Among the countless weapons that contributed to that victory, few left a deeper imprint than the IL-2 Sturmovik. It was not glamorous. It was not fast. It lacked the sweeping curves of a Spitfire or the menace of a Messerschmitt. But it had something else: endurance, adaptability, and an unwavering commitment to a singular purpose. Survival through fire and domination through persistence. With over 36,000 units produced, the IL-2 became the most manufactured military aircraft in history, a testament not only to Soviet industrial capacity, but to the aircraft's battlefield utility. Stalin himself once declared, "The IL-2 is as essential to the Red Army as air and bread." And it was true. No other aircraft was so intimately tied to the Soviet infantryman's advance. Where the boots went, the Sturmovik flew ahead. Its success reshaped Soviet air doctrine. No longer could the Air Force be seen as a separate entity operating in parallel to the Army. The IL-2 forced an integration that echoed long after the war, setting the stage for modern close air support tactics and helping define the importance of real-time coordination between ground forces and air assets. Soviet commanders learned to think in terms of joint operations, where artillery, tanks, infantry, and aircraft were timed and choreographed like instruments in a symphony of violence. Beyond tactics, the IL-2 left a technological legacy. Its armored monocoque construction, once unconventional, inspired future combat aircraft designs. The concept of a purpose-built, highly survivable strike platform found echoes decades later in the American A-10 Thunderbolt II, a machine built not unlike the Sturmovik, with armor around the cockpit, a powerful forward-facing gun, and a mission profile rooted in low-altitude close support. Yet the IL-2's legacy is also human. Pilots flew hundreds of missions in machines that often returned more holes than metal. Ground crews worked around the clock to keep them flying, patching fuselages, replacing engines, loading bombs in mud-choked forward airfields. Entire regiments were formed, decimated, and rebuilt again. Their stories, for a long time, remained buried beneath layers of official reports and wartime mythology. One such story belongs to Anna Yegorova, a female IL-2 pilot who flew over 260 missions before being shot down and captured. She survived the war and later wrote of her experience, describing the aircraft not just as a tool of destruction, but as a cocoon of steel and grit, her only defense in a sky filled with flak and fire. Her testimony, and those of many like her, offer a glimpse into the human resilience that mirrored the aircraft's own. Today, only a few IL-2s remain intact, some restored to flight, others displayed in museums across Russia and Eastern Europe. Standing next to one is a humbling experience. The armor is real. The cockpit is cramped. There is nothing sleek or cinematic about it. And yet, that was always the point. The IL-2 was never built to inspire awe from afar. It was built to close the distance. For the soldiers who watched them fly overhead, for the Germans who watched them descend with rockets screaming, and for the engineers who watched their blueprints turn into steel, the IL-2 represented something larger than its frame. It was the industrial soul of a country under siege, turned into wings. And in a war where entire cities vanished, where nations collapsed, and ideologies clashed with steel and blood, perhaps that's what made the Sturmovik unforgettable. It didn't change the war alone, but it made sure no Soviet advance moved without a shadow of protection. And in doing so, it earned not just its nickname, but its place in the history of air power.